Okay, guys, so today for Friday Food Day, I am going to talk to you about bread making. So, there's a lot of science involved in bread making, um, maybe more than you want to know. Sometimes it's more than I want to know, but it's actually pretty interesting. So, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Um, the biggest thing in bread is the chemical reactions or the reactions that happen when the yeast and the sugars. And then um, so yeast is a fungus. I know it sounds kind of gross, but think of like a mushroom, like that's a fungus, and we eat that also. So it's also so yeast is actually really it's kind of a miracle thing. Like it's really useful. So we only use it. We don't only just use it in baking. We use it in alcohol production. I don't know if any of you have ever smelled beer, but it smells very yeasty. It's because it has yeast in it. Um, and then a lot of alcohols have yeast in it also. And then making drugs like pharmaceuticals, vaccines, and those kinds of things, they use yeast also. So yeast is very, very helpful. And what yeast does is it feeds on like fructose and glucose. Well, fructose and glucose are sugars. So it feeds on carbs, and then it takes those carbs and it turns them into a sugar. And then that sugar is then turned into CO2, which is carbon dioxide. So long story short, that carbon dioxide reacts, and as it reacts, it creates a bubble. And so the bubbles is what helps the yeast rise, what makes our bread rise. So um, I'm not going to go into too much more until I get to the flour part of it. So I'm just going to make my own recipe. There's tons of bread recipes out there. If you want to try it, I would suggest trying just a white bread first because breads can be kind of tricky. So you'll need 2.5 cups of water. I just take the half cup first and I put that in a glass container so you can see how it affects the yeast. Now, I didn't learn how to do this probably until a few years ago when I actually read the Bread Bible. So um, there's lots of useful information in there. So I guess I have a measuring spoon here already. So for my recipe, it makes 2 loaves. So I'm going to use, this is a whole tablespoon. It's the little packets of yeast that you buy in the store. In each one of those, there's 2.25 teaspoons of yeast. So 3 teaspoons makes a tablespoon. So I'm going to add a tablespoon of yeast to just my half a cup of water, plus a little bit more to make that 4.5 teaspoons. So I'm going to put that in there. And then, like I said, yeast needs sugar. So I'm going to go ahead and add my sugar. The recipe that I use calls for 4 tablespoons of sugar. You can also use honey. Or not 4 tablespoons, 1/4 of a cup. So about a tablespoon is what I'm going to add. I use baker's sugar, but you can use any kind of sugar. You can use honey. Honey makes it really sweet. So I put that on top of my yeast. And then I'm going to stir that around a little bit. Something's hot there. I'm going to stir that around a little bit. And then I'm just going to leave it because yeast needs time to. So it's kind of like a capsule. Like if you've taken a capsule, like a medicine capsule when you're sick, and you take it and it's one whole thing. Well, then when it interacts with all the acids and stuff in your stomach, then that breaks apart and the medicine goes into your bloodstream. Yeast is kind of that way also. It's a capsule. It's an endospore. And so it needs to kind of soak and absorb its surroundings for a little bit. I usually let that set for 5 or 10 minutes. It just depends on what my time schedule looks like. I'm just going to leave that in there. So while that's doing that, I can put my other stuff in my mixer ready to go. So in my mixer, I'm going to add the rest of the water, 2 cups of water. Try not to spill it. So then so we've talked about what actually causes the yeast to rise, but then the other thing is, so when those carbon dioxide bubbles are forming, it's kind of like chewing gum. So if you're chewing gum And say you get, so like you have like Double Bubble or Hubba Bubba or whatever floats your boat there. I love bubble gum. So bubble gum is made to blow bubbles, right? But then sometimes you get like, so we chew like the sugar-free stuff, and it doesn't blow the same kind of bubble. You can still blow a bubble with it, but it's not the same like huge bubble that you can get from like regular bubble gum. Okay, so flour is the same way. That's the flour is our bubble gum. So the flour is what creates the elasticity or the structure to hold all these bubbles that are forming in our, I don't know if you can see it real well, but we've got a lot of bubbles forming in our yeast. So you have to have something that's going to support those bubbles. If the bubbles break, then our bread falls. So we have flat bread. We don't want that. So there's all different kinds of flour. I have regular flour, all-purpose flour here. I have whole wheat flour. Today I'm going to use bread flour. There's semolina flour that we use for Italian breads. There's pastry flour. There's rye. Like there's tons and tons of different kinds of flour. Now all different kinds of flour have different amounts of proteins in them. Those proteins, there's two proteins in flour that combine together to which make another protein called gluten. So some of you might be gluten intolerant, so then you can't have bread. Some people can't tolerate that protein for some reason. Thank goodness I am not one of them. But then that gluten is kind of the stretch, or gives our bread the stretch, makes it stretchy. So like gum. So and then the more we work, like so when we knead bread, the more that we do that, the stronger that gluten becomes. So then when our bread, we have a nice rise in our bread, it's able to support all those bubbles that the carbon dioxide is forming with the yeast and the sugar. So I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to use bread flour today. Bread flour has more protein in it, so it just gets I get a better rise from it. If you don't have bread flour right now, any kind of flour is kind of hard to find. I happened to get these. I was lucky and snagged these before all this started. So I add half my flour now. So I'm going to add 3 cups of flour to my water. I don't measure it necessarily, but you don't want to pack it down either. So after that, I'm going to add, so I have 1/4 of a cup of melted butter here. I guess you can't really see it. I wonder if I can do this. So I have melted some butter in a pot. You can have soft butter, that's fine. We just need something that's going to mix well. I'm going to put that in here. I use unsalted butter and 1 egg. And then the egg is just going to act more like a baking powder. Help it give it more rise. Now, just like we can make yeast, we can also kill yeast. So there's 2 things that kill yeast really fast: super hot water and salt. So I never add my salt. You need salt in bread because that's what gives it flavor, but I don't add it until after I've added my yeast mixture into this. So this has risen quite a bit. I don't know how well you guys can see the bubbles, but there's a lot of bubbles forming in there. Most of my yeast has dissolved to be like a pasty kind of formula. A girl that used to work for me at the bakery couldn't stand the sight of yeast, so anytime I made bread or cinnamon rolls, she would gag. So I'm going to go ahead and add it to all of this stuff. And then I'm just going to mix that real quick with my mixer. So this is just a regular mixing paddle. It's just going to break up that egg. I don't mix this for a very long time. I just want it to kind of be smooth. Turn it up a little bit. Stretch it right up. Okay, so that's all I'm going to mix that for right now with this kind of heater. I'll show you what it looks like here in a second. I'm just going to scrape the extra off. Oops, run this to my sink real quick. So this is, oops, sorry about that. This is what our mixture looks like right now. And now this is where we can add the salt and the rest of the flour. So that's what I'm going to do here. This back on. This is a dough hook. So this is what I'm going to use to knead the flour. I very rarely knead anything by hand anymore. Sometimes when I'm making bagels, I will. So now I'm going to add, you'll need a tablespoon of salt. I use kosher salt. You can use table salt. If you're going to use table salt, use a little bit less. Kosher salt is, I'll show you what it looks like. It's, I don't know if you can see that, but it's a larger granule. So it's a little more forgiving as far as taste. It's not quite as strong. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in. And now I'm just going to add a cup of flour or two at a time until I get a good knead going on. You just want it so it starts pulling off the sides and it becomes a ball inside. So I don't know if I can, let's see if I can show that. I need a camera crew here. So you can see it's just mixing in the flour. Not a whole lot going on right now. Once I add more flour, that'll start looking more like a ball. I'm going to go ahead and add another cup of flour. It usually takes between 6 and 7 cups of flour, depending on. Some days it's not a good bread. Like if you're having a rainy, humid day, even though that's the kind of the times that we want to bake bread, it's not a very good time to bake bread. The humidity affects how it raises for some reason. Now that I have added more flour, you can see how it's becoming more of a dough shape than just a muck of mess. So at this point, I'm only going to add a little bit of flour at a time, because if you get too much flour, then your bread doesn't rise. Then you get a really heavy bread, and it doesn't bake as evenly. If you don't add enough flour, it doesn't rise either. So it's just kind of so I'm just going to add a little bit of flour at a time, and I'm only going to add enough until it starts pulling away from the edge and cleans the edge of the bowl. While that's doing that, I'll show you. So I have two different kinds of bread here. This is just a white bread, and I made it in a Pullman pan. So this is actually the shape that you see when you buy a loaf of bread in the store most of the time, especially sandwich bread. So it's just a square pan, and it bakes with a lid on top. So if you can see, like this has a really tight structure in it. That's what you want to see. You don't want it doughy in the middle, and you don't want like a heavy line down here. It means you didn't let it proof enough. So that's the white bread. I made that a couple weeks ago. This is whole wheat bread. I haven't cut it yet because I just pulled it out of the freezer. So this is just a whole wheat bread. It's made 100% whole wheat flour, no white flour at all. Made in a very similar way to what I made this. I just changed the flour. This actually, because whole wheat flour has less protein and less gluten than any other flour, so the structure of that bread is actually a lot fluffier and lighter than this bread. So it's just a difference in flours. All right, so my dough is forming I probably will only add a tiny bit more flour at a time, because as you can see, it's pretty much looks like a ball of dough. So I'm going to let that go for a while so it gets nice and smooth. I'm going to add just a tiny bit more flour, not a whole lot, just to keep it from crawling up the hook. And then I just have to let it raise. And so I put it in a Tupperware bowl with, it's been sprayed, and I seal it just because, like, think about when your skin, you go outside in the summertime or in the wintertime, and if you don't put lotion on or keep it covered, it dries out. Bread is the same thing, same way. And so it'll get like this skin on top if you don't cover it and keep it airtight. And then that also prohibits it from raising higher. So it has to raise, and then once it raises, I'll flatten it out, make it into a loaf, put it in loaf pans, and then I will let it raise one more time before I bake it. So that is really how you bake bread.